Great. I see a few more people showing up, and I'm sure as the United States or the Americas starts to wake up, more people will be joining, and some people coming back from their lunch breaks. And I think I'm great. We're recording now. I think everything is moving along. Hello and welcome to everyone here joining us today to the Future Earth Systems of Sustainable Consumption and Production Knowledge Action Network Online Conference 2022. This is the first conference of this kind. We've held other events in the past, of course, but this is the first one of this kind that we've hosted. And you've all signed up. We really thank you for that. We have 5 days of program prepared, including today, also on Thursday of this week, and then Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday of the following week. And each day has a bit of a different theme. Today, we're going to have a nice keynote speech by Maurie Cohen, who I will introduce in a second. We're going to have a bit of a workshop, a discussion around circular economy and biodiversity. Then on day 2, on Thursday, looking a bit more on education for sustainable consumption and production. On day 3, on Monday next week, to focus in on futures of sustainable consumption and how consumerism itself can be discussed, now and into the future. On day 4, we focus in on waste and thinking about zero waste challenges around making waste circular and a number of these sorts of issues. And on day 5, we wrap things up with a discussion around COVID, which of course had a big impact on our consumption patterns, and also a workshop on a new activity that the KAN is supporting on local actions towards achieving the SDGs. I'd like to just say a few words. My name, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Stephen McGreevy, based at the University of Twente right now, but I'm also part of the steering committee, a co-chair of the steering committee of the KAN, and also a member of the management team. For some time, I've been a part of this group and really find it a nice network. And I should say, for those of you who are new to the KAN, you can sign up for the mailing list in which we disseminate information, or join one of the many working groups we have. Much of the content prepared for the symposium is prepared by different working groups, and we've got a number of different themes, of course, and if you are interested, please look into that. Specifically about the conference, you can download, of course, the conference website, from the website, the program. You can use the chat function here in the Zoom program here to ask questions. There's also a Slack platform that's available for people to discuss and sort of bridge the different time zones. What's nice about Slack is that you can sort of join these different channels and asynchronously have a discussion. We will be recording, as you may know, these sessions, so we'll try to put those up on our YouTube site, but also up in the Slack channel as well, a link to that. Beyond that, though, I mean, we're really open and hopeful that we have a nice discussion, can make some, learn some new things, and really share our experiences as it can. The goal of this conference is to really try to look at not just the research that we've been doing, but to link it to action. And so that was one of the main themes behind this conference itself, is to try to focus in on the action as much as possible, which is always a challenge, but I think it's something that the KAN strives to do. I should also just recognize some of the organizers who've been really helpful. There's a technical team, but also they've been helping with the organization and the websites, based at both the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature, which is based in Kyoto in Japan. So thank you very much, RIN, the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature, and also Academia Sinica, which is based in Taiwan. A number of different folks have been helping us with things to get organized as well from Academia Sinica. So thank you so much. Without further ado, I think we should move into the keynote discussion. Today, we are joined by a good friend of the KAN, someone who's been with the KAN since the very beginning, Maurie Cohen. Maurie Cohen is a professor of sustainability studies at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. He's also the editor of Sustainability, Science, Practice, Policy, and he's been a management team member of the KAN, as I say, since the beginning. And so we all kind of recognize Maurie. He's been part of the KAN and has taken on different roles and as a leader in different discussions. He currently kind of represents the KAN in the Future Earth Governing Council, I should mention as well. So he's very active in Future Earth and the KAN. Today, he's going to give us a bit of an introduction into digital nomadism. The title of his keynote speech is Digital Nomadism, the Future of Consumption and Work in the Post-Pandemic Era. So welcome, we welcome Maurie, and I'll hand it over to you, Maurie. Go ahead.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for the warm and generous introduction, and welcome, especially to colleagues here on the East Coast of the U.S., where it's still a relatively early hour of the day. And I'm gonna bear with me here for a second while I get my slide deck here loaded. And let's see if I can get it. There we go. Okay, so again, welcome. And as Stephen indicated, the theme of my discussion here today is digital nomadism, the future of consumption and work in the post-pandemic era. Or perhaps a corollary of this might be, what might we learn from the experience of digital nomads in the pre-pandemic era that might carry over and give us some insight of how the future is likely to evolve in the coming decades. This figure is presumably recognizable to many who regard themselves as part of the sustainable consumption and production research community in its various facets. For the last 3 or so decades, there's been this kind of dualism between consumption and production, and effort to try to formulate a general theory of sustainable consumption and production. That goal, I think most of us would probably agree, has been fairly elusive, largely because of sort of the incommensurate disciplines and skill sets that are required to approach issues on one hand, the consumption side, and on other hand, the production side. Certainly current work on issues related to the circular economy represents one effort to try to create a fusion or a kind of unification between consumption and production. But in my own thinking about these connections, I've actually found the domain of work to be more productive and to offer a more conducive means of joining these two domains of activity. And so let me just also start off here by saying that I don't have a perfectly working crystal ball, and I don't have any supernatural knowledge of what the future is going to be that's probably any better than anybody else's. So in some respects, these are contestable speculations that I'm going to share with you, but I also think that there is a certain degree of convergence that's beginning to develop that gives, I wouldn't say authority, but gives some substantive determination to what I'm going to outline here today. I had a project focused on digital nomadism that was funded by a philanthropic foundation that maintains deep interest in what we might think of as mobility futures. Foundation is connected to the French National Railroad, and some of you may be familiar with this group. They were very generous with me, and we were due to launch in March of 2020 a rather extensive and elaborate research project that had 3 different research sites that were popular with digital nomads. And I'll say a few words in a minute or two about what exactly digital nomadism is. But we were due to launch in March of 2020, a project with 3 research sites in Bali, the Costa del Sol, and in Costa Rica. And literally just as we were about to head off to the first phase of this fieldwork in Bali, the World Health Organization announced that COVID was a pandemic. And that was pretty much the end of the possibility to do this fieldwork. So we retrenched the project a bit and proceeded in a much more modest direction, one that didn't have such exciting work involved in multiple fieldwork sites around the world. It also threw open or up in the air the whole question of what the future of digital nomadism was. Digital nomads around the world, in some cases, were encouraged and are forced to leave their host countries, and some sort of recognized and saw the writing on the wall that it probably was not a good idea to remain in their nomad locations, and so headed home to weather the pandemic. And so just a little bit of background for those who haven't sort of encountered this idea of digital nomadism. It began to emerge about 2 decades ago. It really kind of hit its stride in the years immediately following the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And within the literature on travel and tourism, the sort of pre-digital nomadism practice was referred to, or continues to be referred to, as flash packing. Flash packers, for those who haven't encountered this term before, are kind of older backpackers. They tend to be more affluent. As a result, they are more attractive as tourists by host destinations. One of the interesting things about the flash packing phenomenon is that these folks would oftentimes travel with a laptop or a digital device, perhaps distinct from their predecessor backpackers, and they would oftentimes combine work and leisure while navigating around to various tourist destinations around the world. So what is a digital nomad? Digital nomad is someone who engages in a form of digital labor that affords a footloose and mobile lifestyle. It professes to provide opportunities for practitioners to live anywhere. Digital nomadism promises a lifestyle that entails a limited number of working hours, and that non-working time of digital nomads is devoted to leisure-intensive activities. And so most probably recognize that part of the attractiveness of digital nomadism is that it is a form of geographic arbitrage. This particular book by Timothy Ferriss has functioned as kind of the Bible of the digital nomad movement. And it offers in its title, the extremely attractive prospect of a 4-hour work week. There are lots of lists that you can find online characterizing or ranking destinations around the world by their attractiveness as places for digital nomads to congregate. Destinations in Vietnam, in Mexico, in Costa Rica, Colombia, Thailand, etc. There's nothing magical or sacrosanct about this particular list, but it does give you some kind of idea of where digital nomads in the pre-pandemic years were heading. These locations became popular because they offered low cost of living, while at the same time being able to enjoy a high quality of life, oftentimes in a coastal setting, opportunities for beach recreation, surfing, and so forth, while at the same time enabling digital nomads to earn, at least prospectively, at a North American or European wage standard. Just to sort of round out the picture a little bit, in the pre-pandemic period, there was a certain kind of semi-illicitness associated with digital nomads. In most cases, they were not paying local taxes on income that they earned. They couldn't be assured, or they couldn't assure themselves of having reliable access to healthcare and other social services in the event of some circumstance of misfortune. And they were kind of living in a gray area about their residency status. Most cases, they were in host countries on tourist visas, and that would sometimes require having to make a tourist run where they would have to leave their host country, go somewhere else for a few days, and then renew their visa upon re-entry. Just a brief sort of taxonomy of who digital nomads are and how they practice their lifestyles. I've sort of divided this into 4 different major categories. What we might think of as group-oriented international worker travelers that tend to congregate in co-working spaces in their host locations. More solo or single international travelers who don't have the same desire or propensity or predilection to sort of link up with their fellow nomads and do so more on a solo travel basis. In North America, there has been this manifestation around this idea of van life, which has a long prehistory in the United States and elsewhere in North America around traveling by recreational vehicle, mobile home, and this is kind of the hipster version of that, where you would drive around and stay in different national parks or other public lands while working to some degree as well, and that the activity has become sufficiently formalized that one doesn't have to sort of hoof this on their own, but there are now companies that you can sign on with who will sort out the organizational details for you and provide you with kind of a seamless experience as part of a working and traveling group. All right, so let's sort of shift gears here a little bit. We then had the pandemic, and remote work proliferated. In most developing countries, we had upwards of 30, 35, 40, 45% of people working during various phases of the pandemic on a remote basis. And there has been all kinds of speculation that remote work represents the future for many people. That has sort of led, the pandemic also contributed to a kind of normalization of digital nomadism. Some may recall that during the early months of the pandemic, in order to sort of revive their tourist economies, you had some countries in the Caribbean, Estonia, which has rather ambitious expectations for itself, developing as a tech hub. These countries began inviting and indeed actively encouraging digital nomads to take up residency. You would arrive in Bermuda or Barbados and quarantine for 10 days and then be given a 6-month visa that would enable you to work from there, no questions asked. And so in many respects, large numbers of us have in one way or another kind of become digital nomads. And so the question I'd like to pursue here is that, what can we learn from the pre-pandemic experience of digital nomads that offers some insight of what the future of work and consumption might be? Is it perhaps the case that pre-pandemic digital nomads, represented a leading edge of social change? That these weren't just millennials and others gravitating to what I think for many of us would seem to be a quite attractive lifestyle, but this was really the cutting edge of social change. That's sort of one image and one means of characterizing digital nomadism. As many might expect, the reality that is presented on Instagram and in Facebook groups and on the internet more generally is very different than the reality, at least for people who are able to achieve a modicum of success. And so what I try to do here in the next 2 slides is highlight the deviance or the variation between the dream and the image and the public projection of what life as a digital nomad might look like and how it is actually lived in practice. So first of all, successful digital nomads do not work just a few hours a day. This idea of the 4-hour work week is mostly a myth, and that to be successful, digital nomads are working 10 hours or more a day, oftentimes, as we are doing here today, managing the challenges of multiple time zones, and that's just sort of sine qua non in order to be able to generate sufficient income. Successful digital nomads often have to sacrifice mobility for locational stability because of complications that they encounter when reestablishing themselves when they move from one locale to another. And so the dream of digital nomadism for many people gives way to what we might think of as digital sedentarism. This idea that you spend a week or two living in one place in Thailand, and then you travel to Vietnam, and then you go to Laos, and then you go to the Philippines and Indonesia. You know, that's first of all quite taxing physically, and just the basic logistics of reestablishing yourself with a reliable internet connection and a place to live and a place to work makes the sort of frequent travel that is oftentimes regarded as a tenet of digital nomadism mostly impractical. Successful digital nomads need to demonstrate rigorous discipline to a fixed schedule rather than to live a life of spontaneous leisure. Digital nomadism in many instances becomes a glorified form of gig, freelance, or contingent labor. Most digital nomads need to spend a lot of time canvassing the internet, looking for their next short-term assignment. So not unlike gig workers in North America or Europe or elsewhere, that there's a lot of downtime that is devoted to looking about for where your next job is going to come from. The types of jobs available to digital nomads tend to afford few opportunities for self-actualization and the realization of professional ambitions. And finally, the digital nomadism lifestyle can oftentimes, on the basis of self-reports provided by digital nomads themselves, be quite lonely and isolating. Digital nomads also suffer from the fact that they are disconnected from the micropolitics that are essential for building interpersonal trust and performing organizational maintenance. So we think about, water cooler gossip as a kind of superfluous activity of working life, when in actual practice, this is quite important. It's a way in which people build social bonds, solidarity, learn who they can trust and who they can't trust. And by virtue of their remoteness and disconnection from sort of day-to-day working practices, digital nomads are not part of those circles. Employers have, perhaps not surprisingly, have learned how to work with, and in some cases actively enable, digital nomadism. So some industries and firms have become quite adept at relying on digital nomads as an outsourced form of relatively affordable skilled labor. And it's important to sort of disabuse ourselves of this idea that, well, contrary to widespread perceptions, that digital nomadism is not primarily attributable to the express preferences of privileged millennials looking to combine work and travel into a purportedly carefree lifestyle, that rather digital nomads are, generally speaking, people who have become marginalized by customary labor markets, but have sources of cultural capital that enable them to adapt in ways that provide a more reassuring life narrative. I'm having a hard time reading my slides as there's text from the Zoom screen blocking. there is a presumed affirmation that remote work is consistent with the aims and objectives that many of us endorse by virtue of our ties to issue area of sustainable consumption and production. There's widespread recognition or acknowledgement that that remote work reduces commuting, allows people to work wherever they want, enhances work-life balance, improves inclusivity and diversity, lowers cost of living, and increases earning capacity. And the list goes on. There's no shortage of commentary about how this shift to remote work holds all kinds of benefits, both environmental and social and economic from the standpoint of sustainability. However, I would like to draw on an observation made a few years ago by our friend and colleague, Mike Maniatis. I'm not sure if Mike is on the meeting here today, but Mike made the provocative observation a few years ago that sustainable consumption is a field characterized by paradox. And I encourage you to take a look at this article, which was published in 2014 in Gaia. And I'd like to sort of use this idea of the inherent paradox of sustainable consumption as a point of departure. And to raise the flag that when it comes to remote work, and on the basis of our experience in understanding sort of what undergirds digital nomadism, that we should all be extremely careful about what we wish for. And that, first of all, working from home is not a new development. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, for centuries, home working was commonplace. And that my sort of speculative claim here is that persistent commitment to 4 and 5 days of remote work per week will lead to disenfranchisement and to marginalization. And the reason I say that is that people who insistently are committed to extreme modes of remote work will, on the basis of past experience, be converted by their employers into freelance laborers. We will have a new form of socioeconomic segmentation where hybrid or full-time face-to-face workers exist in one realm and remote workers are in another domain. And that in due course, probably sooner than we think, remote workers will become, like earlier waves of freelance laborers, increasingly precaritized and vulnerable. And that this day of reckoning, I would contend, is probably sitting just on the horizon. That throughout most of the pandemic, employees have had the upper hand in their negotiations and relationships with employers. But as soon as the belt tightening associated with adaptation to recessionary circumstances begins to take hold, that will change. So it's widely speculated that there will be, by early months of 2023, a potentially severe recession, and that we will see familiar forms of remote work displaced by a rising tide of next-gen automation. and that we will see, rather than the sort of emotional message delivery that has occurred in the past as part of the laying off of surplus workers, that this is going to occur, as we've already seen, at least as far as remote workers are concerned, on a en masse basis. And if anybody who is not convinced of that claim, just take a look back over our shoulder of what's been going on at Twitter over the last 72 to 96 hours, where Twitter has downsized from 7,500 people to about half that size. Most people receiving their separation notifications by email, without any of the challenging, hand-wringing, and emotional outpouring that we might have been previously accustomed to. That it is a short step from remote work to digital offshore, and that I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind this notion that if you can do your job from home, it could get shipped overseas. So those of us in the sustainable consumption and production research world have long recognized that transitions occur through a series of punctuated progressions. And that we've had over the last 15 or 20 years at least 3 shocks. There's a lot for us to learn from how things played out during the 2007-2008 financial crisis. We had the European debt crisis a couple of years later. We've had COVID over the past 2 or so years, and that each of these experiences are not discrete and distinct, but they have built on each other, and that each in their own ways has generated a economic downturn and a recession. Depending on your school of economic thinking, we've had various kinds of recoveries, V-shaped recoveries and U-shaped recoveries, W-shaped recoveries, L-shaped recoveries. But each shock has provided an opportunity for successive waves of socio-technical restructure. And while many of us may have a certain resistance to claims about Industry 4.0, that our colleagues who work in this field, to my mind, are absolutely correct. And that we are very much immersed in a revolution of historic proportions, where labor and work and production and consumption is being reorganized on the basis of cyber physical systems, robotics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and that there will be winners and there will be losers. Losers will be primarily people who have careers and jobs that are anchored in routinized forms of labor, though there are also indications that non-routinized labor, which has long been thought as being protected from this kind of displacement, are also at risk. And so graph here gives some indication of those fields that are most seriously in jeopardy of being made obsolescent. There will be countries that will win and countries that will lose on the basis of pre-existing capabilities and potentialities. And that rather than being a continuing source of ambivalence and uncertainty for employers about, do we bring our workers back? Do we allow them to continue to work remotely? Do we come up with some kind of formula where work time becomes hybridized? My contention here is that remote work will become a key strategy for outsourcing and for offshoring. It'll become an important means for managing economic downturns, for adapting to more extensive automated work processes, and for preparing for a future characterized by greater reliance on outsourcing and offshoring of digital labor. So a few years ago, in a book pictured here entitled The Future of Consumer Society, if I were to revisit the title of that book today, I might add the subtitle and to add some additional content addressing this issue of what is the future of consumer society in an era characterized by the global offshoring of labor. And that we see this occurring in terms of factories of the future that are based nearly entirely on automated work processes. Offices of the future could very realistically be conducted in the metaverse rather than in midtown office buildings. And this opens up fascinating questions, and hopefully have a little bit of time for some discussion about what the future of shopping, the future of consumption and consumerism might be under these circumstances. So I think in concluding here, there's also some interesting questions of a more or less foundational level of what we call this emergent era. Is it deindustrialization 2.0, or maybe even deindustrialization 3.0, depending on our historical perspective? Is it the era of de-servicization? Is it a era in which part of the world is without work? Or to draw on the characterization introduced by Nicholas Bloom, an economist at Stanford, is this the era of service sector globalization or service sector offshoring? So there's an interesting literature that has cropped up over the past year or so addressing these issues, and I would be remiss if I didn't highlight some of it for anybody who would want to follow up on some of these provocative and contested claims. Daniel Susskind's book, A World Without Work. Daniel Susskind used to work in number 10 Downing Street with a prior prime minister, has some interesting, very interesting observations to share in his book. Book that actually came out prior to the pandemic that raises the prospect of accelerationism that from a more sort of Marxist-inspired perspective deserves consideration. John Danner's book, Automation and Utopia, and Phil Jones's book, Work Without the Worker. So I'll just conclude with this sort of observation by Alan Kay, who is one of the sort of foremost innovators of the personal computer. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. And with that, I will bring things to a close and Stephen, I turn it back over to you and invite any questions or discussion that we might have time for.
Great. Thank you very much, Maurie. I'm virtually clapping. I'm not in the metaverse yet, but yeah, very excellent keynote to set this conversation and this conference off on the right foot. I see already some questions in the chat, but this is a time now until 10 past the hour. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A. And I believe I see one conversation or one discussion question, I should say, from Marta Santos Silva. Are you willing, Marta, to read your question aloud to Maurie? You can unmute yourself. I see you there. Marta, are you there? She's at the library. Okay, well then I will read it because it's quite a bit of length, but we'll get into that. And then if you do have a question, please raise your hand. Thank you for the excellent presentation. My perception is that digital nomadism causes both employer and employee to perceive the latter as not being part of the institution or company. On the one hand, regarding the perception of employers, I'd like to ask you for your advice on how to protect digital nomads from the risk of being seen as freelance workers and how to ensure that they can still be promoted despite not being seen. On the other hand, regarding the perception of the employees, digital nomads themselves, I'd like to ask you how we could help them feel as normal workers on a daily basis. I know from my own experience that being a digital nomad can be a very lonesome experience. In the absence of decent co-working spaces in my hometown and having given up the expectation of remaining productive at home, I saw myself come to the local library where I daily meet, but unfortunately don't interact mostly with students and retired seniors. Thank you. So those two questions, what can we do to help the nomads, and how can the nomads sort of not be ignored or not be seen as invisible to their employers? Any advice on that, Maurie?
Yeah, no, that's excellent question, and I appreciate the personal reflections there as well. Without being overly dire, I would have to say that history does not offer very kind sort of points of reference in ensuring a successful and productive and assured future for digital nomads. I mean, digital nomads, despite all of the glamour and attractiveness of this lifestyle, and there's no shortage of appealing and alluring narratives and images and videos. When we were involved in this work, we would sometimes joke that most of what digital nomadism was about was kind of creating a pyramid scheme for inviting and encouraging further waves of people to adopt this lifestyle, and to try to provide services and advisory recommendations to digital nomads. But there's no getting around the fact that digital nomadism, like other forms of contingent and gig labor, these are freelance workers. There have been efforts in the United States and elsewhere to unionize freelance workers and to bring them under the umbrella of social welfare protections. Speaking from the context that I'm most familiar with in the United States, since employers are such an important institutional means of delivering healthcare and other forms of employment-based protections. Obviously, moving someone from an employment status to a freelance status is a way for employers to save money and still get the work done. And I think one of the abject frustrations of digital nomads is that they're given such sort of small segments of projects, whether it's coding or whether it's drafting text, that they are more or less oblivious and completely disconnected and have no understanding of what the larger project is that they are a part of. The relationships tend to be fleeting and instrumental. And that poses challenges. Obviously, for some, there's some advantages that doesn't require working on a 9-to-5 clock and offers flexibility. But it is a new and new form of precarious work. No getting around that.
Great. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I don't see any hands raised and nothing in the chat at the moment.
Marlene has her hand up, Stephen.
Marlene has got her hand up, and then Paul. So Marlene, why don't you go ahead?
Hello. First of all, thank you so much, Maurie. What an interesting project. And as usual, you bring very nice insights to this question of what is sustainable consumption and how to make links to employment. It struck me in listening to you, and maybe it was the reference to Michael Maniatis that gave me a little bit of a tip-off, that we have been critiquing for some time the over-individualization of environmental responsibility when it comes to consumption. And what you're describing seems to also be an over-individualization of how we understand the world of work. Is there a parallel to be made here? And somehow are people who are engaged in this nomadic behavior and this very individualized approach to work also somehow obstructing from view the more collective ways that we should be engaging in personal development in the workplace or fighting for labor rights in the workplace? Is this sort of further cleavage of labor movements and maybe ecologically minded individual nomads? That's really what came to mind as I was hearing you speak.
Yeah, so let me sort of take the question from the perspective of, again, I think Mike's observation about the inherent paradox of sustainable consumption, is very well taken. That we have been disappointed, for decades, that strategies that we thought offered some promise, when scaled even to a modest level, end up boomeranging and giving rise to impacts, whether Jevons-like impacts or other unintended consequences that we kind of shoved under the rug. And so, the slide I had before about, be careful what you wish for. I think probably many of us gathered here upon hearing about digital nomadism circa 2012 or so, when it really began to gather some momentum, probably looked at that as offering some interesting potential, enabling people to free themselves from the shackles of 9-to-5 jobs and to work less. Also an issue that factors very heavily these days into sustainable consumption discussions about work time reduction. And that, with the passage of time, we realized that we kind of had things backwards. So maybe this is a call for humility and sort of recognition of when we're working within contexts that are sort of structurally committed to sets of objectives that reinforce unsustainability, that even our more elaborate propositions are likely to run into difficulty. So I don't know if I see it as a sort of overemphasis on individualism, but kind of a recognition that, and that's probably, this is something that many of us have struggled with, is, and it goes back to 19th century social philosophy, what is the moving engine of social change? Is it production, or is it consumption? And I think what's most interesting about this community is that we have tended to take the sort of unpopular route, and that for many of us who have been involved in this field for some time, there's a certain alternativeness that I think of taking consumption as the moving engine of social change runs up against. And I think that my own thinking has evolved that, is that it is production and it is the world of work that sets the tempo for everything else. But that doesn't get exactly to your question, Marlene, but hopefully it puts it in a slightly wider context. So Paul.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Paul. And then I've got a question from Dan in the chat, but go ahead, Paul.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you, Maurie. Great presentation, very thought-provoking. I was just thinking about some of the practical implications of this digital nomadism. I wondered whether in the course of that project you'd had discussions with those in charge in organisations, perhaps in estates or facilities management, similar functions to that, about what they're going to do with all the buildings, all the space that is no longer occupied if we see more of this digital nomadism. The environmental impacts of buildings are significant, to light them, to heat them, etc. The social disbenefits, some of those you talked about. I mean, I don't think I'm alone, perhaps, feeling that after COVID, my school still feels like the Marie Celeste. I can be the only one in the corridor at times. So I wondered if you'd had either some reflections of those more practical challenges, or wondered if you'd had some discussions with organisations about it.
We didn't have those kinds of conversations per se, but clearly, this has profound implications for the future of cities. There was some very interesting work done by the data analytics group at the Washington Post last couple of months, looking at cities in the United States, first of all, that experienced the greatest shift to remote work, as well as to urban metropolitan regions that were most vulnerable to this process of offshoring. And so, unsurprisingly, Silicon Valley, San Francisco, San Jose are top of the list, but also Washington, D.C. and New York City, and other sort of second and third tier cities that have developed over the last 30 or 40 years as regional insurance or regional financial centers. Yeah, I think there's grave reason to be concerned that, and it's not just, I guess what I previously thought of as COVID giving rise to a pattern of kind of suburban extensification, that kind of lays to waste the kind of metropolitan suburbanization that's taken place over the past century, where you live in San Francisco, or you live in Utah and you work in Toronto, or you work in London and you live in Florida. You know, I really think, you know, I find myself really quite convinced by this sort of offshoring phenomenon, that in much the same way that we saw large parts of industrial regions of Europe and North America virtually vacated, you know, beginning in the 1980s as jobs migrated to China and elsewhere, you know, and that white collar workers presumed that, well, they were safe, you know, that this offshoring phenomenon was a blue collar issue. And, you know, if you didn't live in Detroit, you know, you were okay. But I think that that era is over. You know, and we're already seeing, you know, the depopulation of fields like accounting and legal work. You know, you don't need to have a room full of junior attorneys going through boxes upon boxes of legal depositions. You just feed it into a machine learning system, and you know, what would have been 6 months of work for 100 people is now processed in half an hour. You know, or, you know, that work can be readily moved elsewhere. So I think we're going to have to begin to, so yes, the future of cities, the future of office buildings, what's going to happen to all that investment capital, you know, I think opens up all kinds of challenging questions. It's hard to see really how this is going to play out well, and raises questions that, you know, what happens to consumption? You know, if people are, more and more people are driven into precarious existences, and you know, how does that get maintained? You know, we've been able to do it on the basis of low cost production from East Asian production centers, but that doesn't seem to be a sort of workable strategy given what we're facing now.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple minutes left. I'm trying to field a question from the chat from Dan's iPhone, but it says, how would de Coqueville, I think this is Alexis de Coqueville, what would he say about Nomad as citizen or as a taxpayer, I guess? Any thoughts on that? I mean, it's, yeah, you mentioned they were sort of disconnected from paying taxes, and there's a lot of different issues there, but anything you have on that?
Yeah, so, well, global nomads like to think of themselves as the sort of titular global citizen. You know, but on the other hand, you know, not to put down roots, not to have, you know, geographic investment. And, you know, there is an analogous literature, you know, about sort of more affluent notions of digital nomadism, what we might think about, you know, not people who are living in hostels and working in co-working spaces, but are, you know, traveling the world on yachts as a means of evading the tax man. And you know, on one hand, I think many of us sort of embrace kind of a post-nationalistic notion of global citizenship, but notions of global citizenship without any sense of obligation to particular places quite clearly unravels very quickly. You know, when public authorities are deprived of the necessary revenue that they need to provide essential services. You know, you know, it's not the kind of digital nomadism I was talking about, but you know, it does have its vestige as a form of purposeful tax evasion.
Great. Are there any other questions at all? just have a few minutes. Yeah, maybe we'll be voting in the metaverse. We citizens of virtual countries or something here in the future. I think if there are no more questions, we've gone to the end of this session, and we can have a bit of a break. Let's first then just thank Maurie again for the excellent keynote and for kicking off the conference. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining us so early in the morning on the East Coast there. We're going to have a 10-minute break now before the next session, the session that Paul is a part of and a number of other folks in the working group on circular economy. It's about biodiversifying circular economy research and innovation. We've got a kind of a workshop plan, so stick around. 10 minutes break, go stretch your legs, and join us back here at 20 past the hour, wherever it is you may be. All right, thank you very much. Okay, I think we're all back in the main room. We're back from the break. I hope everyone has stretched their legs, got a cup of coffee, and we're going to move on to the next session. Paul, I guess I'll hand it over to you. All right.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Let me share my screen and say to Maurie, David is here. So, right. Okay. Go with that one. Hopefully you can all see that. If somebody can give me a thumbs up to let me know that they can see that, then that starting slide. I can only see Maurie. Oh, brilliant, Stephen. Thank you very much. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to this first workshop session of the Future Earth Knowledge Action Network on Systems of Sustainable Consumption and Production Conference, which kicked off about an hour ago with Maurie Cohen's keynote on digital nomadism. The conference is going to run until next Thursday. There are 7 further workshop sessions, and so check them out. There, the links on the slide, and sign up for those forthcoming workshop sessions. Now, this session has its roots in the Circular Economy Working Group. The members of whom, oh, I don't believe it, but that's my doorbell. So I'm just going to ignore it, okay, and hope it's the postman. This session has its roots in the Circular Economy Working Group. We can be seen there in the slide. We collaborate on research, education, action projects related to the circular economy. The working group is international, it's interdisciplinary, it includes academics and practitioners, junior and senior. We are open to new members if you are working on topics related to the circular economy and circular society, and you have the time to actively contribute to the group. So we would like to hear from you, and I'll tell you more at the end of this session how you can do that. On this next slide, you will see some of the recent outputs of the group. All of these projects are promoted, stimulated by the members. When we get together as a working group, we invite people to step forward with ideas about projects, and we bring together a coalition of the willing and the able, and it's the able in terms of time, okay, because that's what we all are compromised with. But it brings us together, it brings teams of people together to work on publications, guest editing special issues, putting together grant applications, shaping grant calls, conference sessions, and so on. Now, the concept of the circular economy remains somewhat contested, though there is a degree of acceptance, especially among practitioners, about the circular economy as a system of economic organisation based on the principles of designing out waste and pollution, keeping materials and products in use, and regenerating natural systems. That idea is shown on the left of the slide there, and is taken from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Now, there's no doubt that the circular economy has some wind in its sails. Policymakers, industrial managers, financiers, among others, are ramping up their interest and support for the circular economy. We see momentum, we see bandwagon effects that are propelling the implementation of circular principles and practices beyond the global north. And yet there are big gaps in our understanding. One area of uncertainty lies in the relationship between circular economy strategies on the one hand and biodiversity protection on the other. Biodiversity refers to the diversity and abundance of life on Earth. It includes genetic diversity between species or within species, then between species and within ecosystems. That uncertainty raises questions about which contexts and under what circumstances can the adoption and diffusion of circular practices in both consumption and production support biodiversity? And on the flip side, when is the relationship between circular practices and biodiversity an antagonistic one, where further harm can be caused to biodiversity by implementing circular practices? In this first session of the SSCP conference, we raise and discuss those and other questions. So here's the agenda for today. It's a little bit sort of approximate, but for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to hear the perspectives of researchers, practitioners from a diverse set of organisations, all of whom are considering in their work the implications of circular practices for biodiversity. After we've heard from the speakers, we're going to self-organise. This is not without some trepidation on our part. We're going to self-organise into breakouts. So the speakers have kindly raised points of discussion to frame the breakouts. There's going to be 3 sets of discussions and 3 breakouts, one related to circular production changes, one on circular consumption practices, and one on the unintended systemic consequences of circular changes to consumption and production. Now, I'll say more about those breakouts later. Those breakouts will all be facilitated, and at the end of the breakout time, the facilitators will feed back the observations and insights from each of the 3 breakouts back to the plenary. And then after the plenary, after that plenary feedback, then we'll wrap up with next steps. So that's pretty much how it's going to work. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to the first part of the workshop. So in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to hear insights from our 4 speakers. First up is Tim Forslund. Tim works as a circular economy specialist at Citra. An important part of his work revolves around quantifying biodiversity and climate impacts of a circular transition, understanding the role of bioeconomy and outsourced impacts, and increasing the uptake of standards, such as the science-based targets for nature. Previously, Tim worked for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in the UK and China, and for the Embassy of Sweden in Beijing. Tim's going to share some insights from a recent project that has modelled circular changes to sectors with the largest potential for halting biodiversity loss and regional biodiversity improvements. Over to you, Tim. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Paul. And first, let me just thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here today and to, well, not least to discuss and share ideas around this topic. So I look forward to the breakout groups. But before that, I'd share a few things about our latest research and the study that we have done on how the circular economy can help tackle biodiversity loss. So thank you for the introduction already, Paul. So as mentioned, I work for the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra, which is a combination of two things: a think, do, connect tank. So we provide insights and analysis. We test things on the ground in Finland, and we also provide convene different stakeholders and provide a platform for them as well, for instance, through the World Circular Economy Forum. And we're also a future fund. And we work on a range of different topics, from fair use of data, democracy, lifelong learning, and of course, the energy transition and climate, biodiversity, and the circular economy are also important parts of our work. And I'd mention as well that I think one important part of the circular economy and the work we've done there, we, for instance, Sitra led the work with the first national circular economy roadmap in 2016. So we've worked with this in Finland for some time. But it's also to think of how the circular economy can be used as a tool. So we're here to talk about biodiversity today, but in 2018, we worked with our partners to establish what the link is also for climate change. So we see that in EU heavy industry, the circular economy can tackle about half of emissions. And we were thinking that, is it possible to do something similar for biodiversity? And through this study, Tackling Root Causes, we published just a few months ago. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I'd also highlight that since we started with this work, there's been a lot of attention into this topic, and we see studies from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the French National Institute for Circular Economy, IUCN, and EEA are also right now working on their respective studies. And of course, the Finnish Environment Institute, and we have Eni Rokamo with us here today to speak from Finland's experience. So that kind of was what helped set us on our course for this work, to look at what can be done also at a global level. But this was really the starting point. But in our study, then, we look at, first, you all know what the circular economy is, but what does it mean if you try and model it? So I'd highlight this example from Research Institutes Sweden, where we talk about, well, firstly, how long does something last? Secondly, what is the use rate? Is it actually used, or is it idling? And thirdly, what is the recirculation rate of products and materials? So these are all things that can reduce our resource use, which in turn enables less land to be used. So that can leave room for nature to thrive. But on top of that, Paul also showed this slide from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation with the three principles. So we also talk about regenerating natural systems. So it's really important to look at, what do we do with the land we use for production? How can we drive biodiversity outcomes there, rather than just leaving room for nature to thrive? So we need to talk about both, and we can measure both as well. So what did we actually look at then in our scenario, which we created with together with Vivid Economics, who provided analytics for the Discupta review previously? So if we talk about food and agriculture, these, I should mention also that these four sectors, we first looked at which sectors have the biggest impact on global biodiversity loss, and in these sectors, where can the circular economy play a meaningful role in tackling this biodiversity loss? So what we modeled, then, the assumptions that went into this was that we'd reduce our meat consumption and food waste by half by 2050, and we'd shift to regenerative agriculture as well as forestry across quite large areas, while we'd make sure that clothes last longer and we'd recycle more of them, while the expansion of cities would be more confined so as to reduce urban sprawl. And the building materials that we use would be, we'd make buildings with less building materials, and in buildings that last longer, and through which we also, or in which we use these building materials to reuse and recycle more of our building materials. So what we found was that together, all these levers can free up an area of land corresponding to 1.5 times the size of the European Union, while we could spare or save forests corresponding to the size of Argentina. And if we continue as before, we will continue to lose biodiversity by to 2050 and beyond that. There's no question about that. But if we enable these transitions across these 4 sectors, we can see quite a significant shift. And especially as you see the food and agriculture, it's not just significant, but it's also something that can happen quite fast. So if we zoom in on these different sectors, we see the biggest impact coming from the shift away from animal and land intensive protein sources to less wasteful alternatives, for instance, plant-based alternatives, while we'd reduce food waste. And we also see, I mentioned that we also need to talk about regenerative agriculture and forestry, and taken together, by driving these regenerative outcomes, we can see that that's about 10% of the scenario. So it's still significant. And you also see a slightly negative impact from an increased demand of construction timber. So Paul also mentioned that there can be negative impacts unless we're careful. So if we're just substituting certain materials for bio-based materials is not inherently better. In fact, if we talk about a circular economy, a circular bioeconomy, it's not inherently circular to just shift. So there are different understandings of the circular economy, and if this shift to bio-based is really part of the circular economy or not. But the point is that we need to make sure that we can't just expand our demand for bio-based resources, because we just don't have those resources. So what we find is, just mention our key findings, that the circular economy can tackle biodiversity loss and even enable a small recovery to 2000 levels by 2035. And as mentioned, the biggest impact is from the food and agriculture sector. Another pair of well, good news, you could say, is that the same measures are largely effective for tackling climate change. For instance, we could reduce methane emissions from agriculture by almost 90%. And in the EU, we could meet the LULUCF, the land use change and forest sector targets by 2030 through this scenario. More than that, the circular economy can also build resilience. And for instance, we could enable a 30% reduction in nitrogen fertilizers, which, as you probably have heard, have skyrocketed in price over the last few months as well. So it's an important tool also for building resilience. A sort of +1 finding that I would mention is also that these impacts are at the global level. We can reduce food waste in Finland, in the UK, but some of these biodiversity improvements will be manifested in changes in biodiversity in other regions. So we can't just look at this in Europe. And as mentioned in the Disruptor review as well, if you look at, for instance, in Africa, we see that about 26% of the biodiversity impacts are due to consumption in other parts of the world. So it's really important that we address this at a global level, because this is also where we can see some of the largest improvements in biodiversity. So I was asked by Paul also just to share a few implications of what this means for businesses and policymakers. I'll try and say a few things about both, but firstly, we need to really prioritize measures that tackle both climate change and biodiversity loss at the same time, so as not to just add additional things. And I think here the circular economy is really key, because it can provide quantifiable impacts to address both. And as mentioned, we need to address this at a global level, as a lot of our biodiversity impacts are outsourced today, due to only a small number of products, really. So here are the new rules addressing deforestation-related supply chains, such as coffee, beef, wood, palm oil, and some other commodities. It's really important. But at the same time, this is not enough in itself unless we also address the total pressure from these impacts, so production doesn't just shift elsewhere as demand continues to be very high. So for these food waste reductions, and if you talk about food design of new alternative proteins, that some ways that we can tackle this, but we also need price signals to reduce the pressures from products that today have a really high impact on biodiversity. Secondly, I think the biodiversity impacts that we have modeled, it's by and large due to biomass production. So it's a limited resource, and we need to reserve it for high value applications. So here, price differentials and secondary raw materials, well, we need to use these price differentials to make secondary raw materials become cheaper than virgin materials, basically. And one way we can do that is to ensure also that we favor reused and recycled timber, which in Finland is very low currently, that rate. And we can also invest in garment to yarn recycling that we have done in Finland, for instance. And here we have the technology today, and a lot of it is open access as well. So we have the solutions, we just need to scale them, and we need the investments here. But at the same time, it's not just about having more of our textiles recycled. We need to ensure that we have a quality target as well, so that we don't downcycle textiles to insulation materials and other products, so that they actually replace cotton that we would use for clothes, that we continue to keep it as high a value as we can. I'm not seeing that kind of very prominent in the EU work with the textile strategy. And also, as mentioned, alternative proteins are really key. And here, China has mentioned it in the last 5-year plan. The EU is talking about a protein strategy. And some countries are already investing into this, such as in France and in Denmark. So I think here also the work with the Sustainable EU Food System Initiative, we can play a role here through public procurement. It could be a powerful way of driving this change. And lastly, I mentioned also that we can reduce resource use, but it's also really important that the area that we do use for production remains, that helps improve biodiversity outcomes as well. So I will stop there. And well, I was asked also to just mention some challenges ahead that we can discuss in the room. So if this kind of biological side of the circular economy becomes more important, what can we do to make sure, do we need a new framing for that, or is there something else we need to be careful with? And also just that the biomass today is just not the demand and the available supply. It doesn't add up. There's about a 40 to 70% gap by 2050. So we need to think about this, and hopefully we can discuss some of that today. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Tim. Let me go back to my screen. Okay, so you should all be able to hear that. Next up is Enrique. So Enrique Puccini is an Economic Affairs Officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, based in Geneva, where he works on trade and circular economy issues. Enrique leads the implementation of the Sustainable Manufacturing and Environmental Pollution Programme, funded by FCDO and aiming to reduce pollution from manufacturing in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So Enrique, well, I'm delighted to ask you to share some of your insights from UNCTAD initiatives around circular economy and biodiversity. Over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks, team, also for laying out the groundwork. By the way, I'm really inspired by the work of Helen MacArthur Foundation and CITRA in covering the deep analysis of this relationship between circularity and biodiversity. I think both institutions have done a great work on that space. From the UNCTAD side, we have for many years the BioTrade Initiative, which is a program supported by the Swiss government that has always looked at biodiversity as an asset to avoid a natural degradation, especially in the forest areas in the global south. Biodiversity-based products and services can help create income sources that, if sustainably managed, can avoid biodiversity and forestry loss. So as an indirect contributor to various agendas. I'm not going to talk about the bio-trade initiative, which we have, and it's a long-standing program. I'm going to mention some examples, perhaps from our other initiative, which is the SMEP program, which we have with the UK. It's called Sustainable Manufacturing and Environmental Pollution, which basically tries to prevent pollution from leaking from industrial sites into the environment and then bringing consequences to the natural environment, biodiversity is included, and to human health. As we know, environmental impacts of economic activity, trade, production, transformation, they have been often framed as a monodimensional issue, talking about CO2, for example. We see that, for example, in metrics of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emission preventions. A lot of businesses are working on that, improving their carbon footprints, but we don't see that same discussion for biodiversity metrics. This is why the work that was previously mentioned by Tim is important. We should have ideally same metrics or more visible metrics for other types of pollution that go beyond CO2. What am I talking about? If I have presenter rights, I'm going to try to share my screen briefly here. Yeah, I think you can see the portal. This is a dashboard we are creating for the SMEP program, which looks at trade and export, especially of different products from various countries, and has a sub-module looking at plastics. The interesting thing is that we have, for a specific set of countries, Bangladesh, Congo, Ethiopia, and so on, we have looked at different products, for example, their plastic version, like a polystyrene plate, and their substitute or potential substitute, which uses a natural product, for example, a plate made out of banana leaves. And then of course, we have global warming here as one of the indicators, the famous CO2 and related emissions, but there are many other environmental dimensions that can have a strong impact on biodiversity, which are not often discussed and which are often forgotten. So for every product, for every material shift, if you want to go from a plastic stand, a bottle, a cup, a plate, or a B2B issue like a vessel, you can find a substitute in a natural material, cotton, jute, aluminum, but those substitutes also carry environmental impacts. So it's important to know that many of those environmental impacts involve ecotoxicities, which are directly affecting biodiversity. For example, here, a banana leaf plate, it ranks worse on a marine ecotoxicity than a polyester plate. The same with ozone formation, and the same with freshwater eutrophication. So all of those indicators of life cycle analysis show that if we change from something that is already complicated, for example, plastics, which create problems in the downstream, we might change for something that creates problems in the upstream. So problem in a lot of environmental talk, related to how those products are made. I invite everybody to look at our SMEP program website. It's called the Trade and Pollution Dashboard. You can see a bunch of different comparisons for roads not taken for different materials, especially if we want to get away from plastics. It's quite an interesting read. So that's my first point. We should always look at other types of pollution beyond CO2, especially those that are affecting our biodiversity assets. Another thing that I thought of raising here is the issue of labeling. It also connects with the CETA presentation. It's important that the consumers know what they're buying, right? We already have product passports that transmit the greenhouse gas emissions footprint of a certain product up to the consumer end, but we don't have the type of information transmission on biodiversity tolls or losses up to the consumer end. So often you buy something in a supermarket or a piece of garments in a shop, you don't know how positive or negative this has been to biodiversity assets where the materials, the composing materials were produced. So I think that this type of information ledger and transparency added to what you are buying, it's important also to use consumers as a driver of transformation. You also have the issue of public procurement. So if you have a better labeling, perhaps public procurements, green public procurement, can be used as a way to increase the scale of those markets. So prioritizing those products that have a better biodiversity conservation pattern. This is already being used in various sectors, including for material shift, for low carbon purchases, but also why not using biodiversity metrics to guide public procurement. And finally, I would also like to raise the example of the SMEP program, where we're working on various types of projects. The interesting thing about SMEP, it's not only talk, right? It's talk and teeth. We have together the UK around 20 million pounds for various projects to help to put products in the market and also upscale innovations, both in manufacturing pollution, so capturing pollution, various types of pollution from industrial sites and textiles and leather production, in plastics transformation in Africa and Asia, and transforming those current called as pollutants into something useful, into materials that are reinjected into the productive cycle. And we have a bunch of projects that are already operational in the area of plastics. For example, covering areas like biodegradable fishing nets, which help to preserve marine life. We also have projects on better mulch films for agriculture and for food packaging, because mulch films, it's something that we don't see often in agriculture, that preserve the humidity of soils, and they are often made of plastics. So we are funding projects that are tackling those areas that are very complicated to substitute, but very important if they do so, because they leave a lot of pollution in nature. And also we are looking at a solid residue and liquid discharge, especially treatment systems to do something useful like biogas, anaerobic digestion, with the discharges from factories, in order to make the factories more economically efficient and also to discharge less into the environment. The downstream of those, the production system have a high toll on biodiversity. I was recently in Pakistan, at the outskirts of Lahore. I've seen the textile clusters and the tannery clusters in that region, and it really, you see rivers of pollutants or liquid polluted water that basically contain no fish, no life, because it's far gone. And that type of production, of our production systems, need to take clean water in and pump clean water out. We're not there yet. So as long as we don't have this, our biodiversity will be paying a price, and indirectly our economic systems that rely on biodiversity, such as agriculture, might have its productivity affected. So I don't want to get into many more details, but I think that the issue of biodiversity, it's intrinsically connected to how we produce and trade things, and how aware or unaware are consumers and buyers of what they are buying. So we're trying to work and operate a bit in that space. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Enrique. Okay, let's just again share my slide again. So next up is Eni Ruokamo. I hope I've got that right, Eni. Eni is a senior research scientist at the Finnish Environment Institute. She is an environmental economist with a particular interest in circular economy and biodiversity, amongst other environmental issues. Eni is going to share some reflections from a recent project assessing circular actions that reduce raw material extraction, relieve land use pressures to promote biodiversity. And this is a deep dive into Finland and I think the construction sector. Eni, over to you.
So thank you, Paul, and thank you for the invitation. Are you able to see my screen and hear my voice?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay, so I will start then. So today I'm here to tell you about our research in which we investigated the effects of different circular economy actions on biodiversity. This project was actually conducted already around 2 years ago, and this is a joint work that has been conducted with my colleagues from the Finnish Environment Institute. So why we ended up studying the impacts of circular economy on biodiversity in the first place? As we all know, there is an urgent need to stop the biodiversity depletion globally and nationally. For example, Finland did not reach its target in halting the biodiversity loss by 2020. So the Finnish government again made a new target that was set on 2030. And overall, it seems evident that at the production and consumption side, we need implementation of circular economy solutions to stop this negative development, which biodiversity is experiencing all around the world. And at the same time, when we were conducting the study, we realized that we cannot find much academic literature on the relationship between circular economy and biodiversity. So in our study, our objective was to demonstrate how to conduct an impact assessment of circular economy actions on biodiversity. Our case study country is Finland, which is one of the Nordic countries. And in the research paper, we focus on two key sectors, which are construction and real estate sector and forest industry. And in today's presentation, I will focus on the construction sector as the time is limited. So the main aim of our research was to shed light on the possible impacts and impact change of circular economy actions on biodiversity. And as the literature on the topic was very scarce, we also needed to carefully consider how to actually conduct the impact assessment. Thus, we ended up using both qualitative and quantitative methods and different kinds of data to add understanding on the topic. For example, we utilized an environmentally extended input-output model called ENVIMAT to explore and understand the pressures that the economic activity in Finland creates on biodiversity. We also used literature and workshops to identify relevant sector-specific circular economy actions to be included in the assessment work. These steps enabled us to then move forward to the exact circular economy impact assessment on biodiversity. And in this impact assessment, we utilized a combination of different kind of information sources, including, for example, most recent findings from species and habitats red list assessments in Finland. Okay, and here I have listed the covered CE actions in the assessment work for the construction and real estate sectors. They included actions such as optimizing the use and increasing material efficiency and reuse of different building materials. We also included material substitution into our assessment work and considered an action where instead of concrete and metal, wood would be utilized as building material where reasonable. Moreover, we also covered actions focusing on designing buildings to be long-lasting and investing in renovations, as well as solutions focusing on space use minimization, among other aspects. And then to the results. And here I have a pressure figure that illustrates the potential of different circular economy actions in the construction and real estate sector to mitigate pressures towards biodiversity. In the middle, you can see the covered CE actions in our assessment work. And on the left-hand side, you may see the main inputs, which are, of course, linked to the natural resource extraction and land use change that create the link between the circular economy actions and biodiversity. On the right-hand side, you may see the main habitats affected in this sector. Overall, in construction, biodiversity impacts arise mainly through the extent and intensity of land use. The direct effects of land use are particularly pronounced in built environments, which consist, for example, of population centers and industrial sites. Then the building material industry creates another impact channel on biodiversity. The biodiversity impacts of wood construction are naturally derived from the extraction of materials from forest habitats, whereas the impacts related to the manufacture of cement and concrete especially affect rocky habitats and eschers. But next, let's have a look on the estimated impacts for different circular economy actions. The green arrows indicate that the CE action reduces pressures towards biodiversity, and the red one indicates on the other way around. The thickness of the arrow roughly estimates the magnitude of the potential impact. We estimated in our work that the biggest positive potential to mitigate biodiversity pressures relates to the two upper CE actions, which are the lifetime extension of new and existing building stock, as well as the space use optimization. These actions can significantly reduce the need for new construction now and in the future. And this means that the demand for building materials can decrease in the long run, and also the need for finding new land for construction is mitigated. We also find that CE actions which improve material efficiency, cascading use, optimize material use, and add reuse of building materials all have a good potential for biodiversity impact reduction. All these actions reduce the demand for building materials by making more from less. And again here, the substitution action is trickier. This action decreases biodiversity pressures linked with the manufacture of steel and concrete products. However, manufacturing wood products for construction purposes is likely to increase pressures towards forest biodiversity. And in Finland, the forestry and forest industry already cause the highest land use and biodiversity pressures. In addition, the land use related harmful impacts on biodiversity are likely to be greater in the case of forestry than in the case of mining when different products have the same functionality. So then to the main takeaways from our study. Because land use and extraction of natural resources are the key drivers of biodiversity loss both in Finland and globally. Those circular economy actions that help to reduce the uptake of virgin raw materials and decrease the land use pressures are the effective ones in safeguarding biodiversity. These inner cycle circular economy actions are typically able to reduce environmental impacts of production activities and the extraction of raw materials across industries and production chains. In our study, we covered several sectors and their relevant CE actions, and overall, we found that circular economy actions mainly have positive effects on biodiversity. The only clear exception we found related to the substitution of non-renewable materials with renewable ones, where we identified that this substitution could lead to higher land use pressures on biodiversity, as I also demonstrated in the construction and real estate example. Thus, we have to pay attention to the sustainable harvesting levels of these renewable materials, and, for example, utilize biodiversity in enhancing forest management practices. And here I also have some literature. Also, the Sitra's study is mentioned here, and thank you. And then I also promised to for the breakout room discussion us in this session to think about two aspects. The first one is how we could boost these inner cycle CE actions to be adopted more widely in the economy. And the second one is actually pretty much the same one as Tim also raised. So how we can assure that this kind of a substitution with renewable materials does not drive us to even bigger pressures towards biodiversity. So that was kind of my main takeaways. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Eni, for that. Let me share my screen again. Just bear with me, my slide shifted. Okay, there we go. Okay, so finally, and stepping late into the breach when a couple of our invited speakers were regrettably unable to join us. Jose Pineda Mendoza is a professor of business administration at the Universidad Privada San Juan Bautista in Peru. His research focuses on understanding processes of sustainable economic transformations that lead to development in developing countries. That interest has led him to focus on a project looking at how circular practices are applied in the Amazon rainforest. And Jose is going to share with us some initial insights from that ongoing work. Over to you, Jose. Or you're on mute, Jose.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So let me know, please, if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see that, Jose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for the opportunity. As Paul just mentioned, I'm Jose Pineda, and I'm representing also my colleagues Paul Dewick and Ronnie Ramlo, and we're conducting our research on the circular economy in the Amazon rainforest. Now, why the Amazon rainforest? Because it's a highly informal place. It has high rates of social vulnerability, and it's a biodiverse natural environment. So we thought that it was a good idea to see how such environments would adopt these type of practices. Now, as Paul just mentioned, the research is still ongoing. We have already interviewed some experts on the region, international and local, some local entrepreneurs, NGOs, and representatives from local indigenous communities. So we're going to share some examples and some insight from this research. So we have already discussed a little bit of this. I would just mention that this research will focus mostly on regenerate natural systems. And the other important link to this research is the informal economy, which, as we know, one of the things that we know about the informal economy in developing countries is that it's highly pervasive, it's very stubborn, right? And it goes beyond just the connection of how these informal actors register formally, because it's really how they live and how they experience their livelihoods. So taking this into mind, this is how we frame our research. Now, what we're missing, and this is something that we have been discussing quite a lot within the research team, is that more research needs to focus on how the emergence, right, of circular economy could connect informal producers, right, with formal value chains. And we believe that this is one of the most important questions, especially in developing countries where informal economy is absolutely pervasive. So in the Amazon region, for example, we can see figures of 80 or 90% of the population being part of the informal economy. A second important question that we believe we're still discussing and requires more research about is how we bridge sustainability with economic development in biodiverse natural ecosystems, because there's not a clear connection between the three of them. No? And as a question of this is how new types of organization and institutions will have to emerge so that we can conduct sustainable processes of development in these regions. Okay, So let me briefly mention why the Amazon rainforest. So the Amazon rainforest is one of the most biodiverse places in the world. It still has very large indigenous communities, and it is quite isolated from major urban areas. Transport is mostly fluvial. There are some roads, there are some airports, but within the region, the transport is through rivers. And there's a huge population that works within the informal economy. As I mentioned, it's about 80 or 90%. It's really difficult to measure, but it's about that size. And it's a place that requires better services, better social safety nets. It lacks infrastructure and a strong presence of the government. So it's a particular region, and this needs to be taken into account because it's interesting to see how this biodiverse place takes upon such circular initiatives. So I will give you some examples and some insight from the interviews that we have been gathering. So one of the most important things to take into account is that this is a region of smallholders. Even they participate in large communities, they are still smallholders, and each one of them or each region has a particular way of implementing regenerative types of agroforestry. So it's typically a rotative type of agricultural model. You can see, for example, in picture 1, you can see the fallows, and in picture 2, you can see the patches, right? And this type of agricultural model goes from 1 to picture 2 over and over again over the periods of decades. So this is how these indigenous communities tend to implement their agroforestry in these regions. Now, what we have come and what we have been discovering is that in the last 30 years, they have been growing more vulnerable, mainly because of illegal activities in the region, and we will discuss that a bit more later on, and also because of migration. So people from the Andes are migrating consistently to the rainforest, and they require new places of land. Now, this becomes a huge problem when you have this type of rotative, regenerative type of agriculture, because you require large extensions of land. And these indigenous communities are starting to be locked in by migration. Now, this becomes even a worse problem when you have no property rights in place, you know, and there's not a strong presence from the government. Now, this has been consistently occurring during the past decades. And what these actors have been mostly doing is, first of all, they've tried to recuperate poor land. Then they have increased quite a lot the rate of rotation between the fallow and the harvesting areas. And they have been passing the land to younger generations. So it had a strong social component as well. Now, even though they have been recuperating the land, this recuperation is quite expensive, and you can see that in picture 4, because the recuperation of the land is, first of all, labor intensive, and it's really expensive in terms of time. And once you recuperate a poor piece of land, it takes about 3 years or more so that it can provide enough yields to support the household, for example. So if smallholders have no savings, and they are losing land to migrants, for instance, this context makes them increasingly more vulnerable, and they cannot continue with this type of regenerative agriculture. Now, I've just described one model of Sweden agriculture. There are many of them in different places in the Amazon rainforest. Now, but there are also very interesting practices that can also be called circular or sustainable. For example, in picture 3, you can see how these smallholders are using charcoal to recuperate faster the land. Now, the production of charcoal is within the reach. It's quite an innovative practice for many of these communities, but it's also labor consuming and it's quite expensive. So that's, for instance, a challenge to scale up these type of practices. Now, I also wanted to show you an intervention and how how these interventions might work at different levels. So in picture one, we have what it's commonly known as an Amazonian palm tree, an aguaje. And this is a very common tree, and in the picture 3, you can see the fruit. And this is a very well-valued fruit in the region. Now, not so long ago, there has been a process of deforestation of these trees. So those communities which economies were based on this type of activity were in serious problems. And some of them started to adopting harnesses, as you can see in pictures 2. Now, these harnesses might be quite simple technologies, but the implementation was not straightforward. And it was not straightforward because it requires, for instance, new funding, it requires training, but most importantly, it requires that there's, it impacts the social composition of the communities, because now the older population of the communities cannot participate of this economic activity. Only the young population of the communities would participate from it. So it required a new composition on how the governance of this community took place. So this was an important aspect in the adoption of these practices. Another important aspect, for example, was that NGOs played an important role in bringing this technology, in funding it, in training people to use it. And a third important aspect was that those communities that were closer to markets had a better chance of adopting them because of logistics. So logistics in this place, as I mentioned earlier, they transport tends to be fluvial and it's quite expensive. So all these changes and all these investments need to pay off at some economic level so that the community can implement them and maintain the implementation of these circular practices. And finally, I wanted to show you also the example of how an informal value chain might connect with some illegal activities, which is something that comes quite strongly in many of our interviews as well. So in pictures 4, 5, and 6, you can see there the rivers, the roads, and the ports. And these are the 3 main points of control. The government controlled these 3 points, but they don't have much presence in picture 1, which is the community, 2 and 3, which is the places where the lodging of the trees are performed. So what this creates is a space for illegal activity and the black market of formal permits. So what happens is that illegal lodgers, when they arrive to points 4, 5, and 6, they arrive with a permit, even though the lodging has occurred in areas that were not protected, that were not official. And this connects with the informal economy, for example, because they require informal smallholders to perform these activities because it's, again, labor consuming. And some of the smallholders might be forced into these activities, and others, with time, they do it voluntarily because it represents an important income for their families. So I will leave it just there. Let me just remind you, this is an ongoing investigation, an ongoing research. If you have any questions or if you feel that you can participate as an expert, please just let us know. And some of the questions that we were describing and discussing around these issues that we would leave for the breakout rooms are, for example, how can we reduce the uptake of raw materials, decrease land pressures, and safeguard biodiversity? How can more regenerative practices be promoted, or what types of metrics can we create in order to manage better this biodiversity? So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Okay, so back here. Okay, so we're running very nicely on time, halfway through our allocated time, and we are now able to move on to the second part of the session, which is the breakouts. So this is the opportunity for you to have your say Now, we weren't entirely clear how many people we were going to have, so we had various contingencies, but not this one, which I'm going to thrust on my facilitators, colleagues. I think, given the numbers, we're just going to go for 2 breakout sessions, okay? The breakouts have 2 main purposes. First, they aim to focus further discussion around some of the issues raised by the speakers. Second, they're an opportunity for you to contribute your ideas and reflections from different contexts about the practical circular economy actions that can support biodiversity. There are many gaps in our understanding. We don't know all the questions, let alone have all the answers. So we very much welcome your perspectives. Both of these breakouts will be facilitated. The breakout chairs will let themselves be known and will lead the discussion around some questions that we prepared earlier, but also if there are, if there are questions that you want to raise there, please do. We're going to have about 40 minutes or so for these breakouts before we come back together. So Jose and I will lead the first breakout session, which is on the production side of systems to consider how circular economy practices could be promoted to improve or to reduce, biodiversity loss. That breakout's going to get into questions about supporting technical and biological circular practices, the role of government and business, and new technology. The second breakout group, which Maurie and David are going to lead, focuses on the consumption side of systems, again, to consider how consumption practices can be promoted that support biodiversity. So that breakout's going to attempt to unpack the demand side interventions, how to create markets for biodiversity sensitive products and services, consider some of the challenges of shifting to more biodiverse consumption. We did have a third topic, which was relevant actually to both of these two. So we also have additional questions which Enrique raised about, and others actually, about the unintended or second order consequences of these changes that we make in the name of circular, but which might have negative effects for biodiversity. So we've got 2 breakout groups. Our technical colleagues have offered 2. So breakout 1 is going to be around the production aspects. Number 2 is going to be around the consumption aspects. Jaco and Stephen, my other co-facilitators, you can go to whichever of these takes your fancy. Speakers, similarly, again, we originally were going to have 3, so now we're having 2. So please go to the one with which you feel more comfortable. So I'm going to give you a minute or so to make those choices. You can see, you can see, I can't actually see now how you do this on the, if I stop sharing for a minute, that might help me. Okay, so it's in more and breakout rooms, and there is room 1 and room 2. We don't go into room 3, it'll just be a black hole. In fact, it's just disappeared. So we've got rooms 1 and room 2. So please take a moment to consider which one you're going to go to, and then we will start in a minute or 2's time. So we can consider some of these production side issues, consumption side issues, unintended consequences. like I said before I sent you off into the breakouts, these questions have all been raised by the speakers as really as conversation starters. So this is an emerging field. I think Annie said that when she started her project and was looking for existing literature on this topic, she found very little. And there is some work, for instance, such as been done by Citra and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and there are a handful of studies in the academic literature, but it is still quite nascent. So I invite you to share your own reflections on things, your own insights from considering these issues. Perhaps it's been in a context of a country, rather like Jose's work and mine on the Amazon, or as in the case of Annie, for instance, about Finland, or it could be more general than that. So please share your insights with us. So I'm just going to lob this question in, and it's, oh, Tim, go on. Sorry, got your hand up.
No, I thought I just wanted to comment on that. I think the and just to say that, well, before the Finnish Environment Institute did this study, there was next to nothing about this, and then it's only after they did this study that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and etc. have worked on this. So it's a very nascent field indeed. But also just that we did know a little bit beforehand, as well as the International Resource Panel pinned down this number: 90% of biodiversity loss, or specifically 90% of land use related biodiversity loss, is due to the processing of natural resources. So we know what the problem is, that we extract too many resources at too high a rate, and that's causing biodiversity loss. But what then is the solution? And that's where the circular economy comes in. So just why wasn't that provided in the first place? So I think that's we look forward to hearing your experiences about that.
Excellent, Tim. Yeah, very well said. And why don't we take off there? Annie, for instance, talked about those, what she called inner cycle circular economy actions. So material efficiency, optimization of material use, reuse, extension of the lifetime of products. So just as Tim says there, how can we support those types of actions that reduce the virgin materials, decrease land use pressures, safeguard biodiversity? What share some of your reflections on that challenge. Enrique.
More of a question to perhaps Tim or Annie, who touched on this subject. It's if we are advancing a bit more towards having parameters and have metrics on biodiversity loss, do we also have initiatives ongoing that are trying to attribute those parameters to products, meaning like converging towards a metric where we can see a labeling of products based on their biodiversity footprints? That's my question to the whole group. Thank you.
Yeah. Have you seen any reporting and any sort of really good examples of reporting around biodiversity impacts, Enrique, in your work with the SMP program? Sorry.
We haven't gone as far as to try to measure the specific impact on biodiversity. We mostly focus on the discharges themselves, or what is going to the environment, not specifying what is the recipient in that environment, and a bit of on the human health as well. But specifically on species, we haven't done this parameterization. That's the boundary of our project.
Maurie, and then Annie.
If you can hear me, when Paul, when you parachuted into the other room, I was just in the midst of making a bit of a soapbox presentation and kind of characterizing myself as a circular economy skeptic. And I don't mean to kind of rain on the parade, but with such a distinguished group of circular economy experts here, and I don't consider myself to be a circular economy expert in general, let alone one on the relationship to biodiversity. But I'd like to sort of pick up on a comment, Paul, that you made before about how circular economy has the wind in its sails and has now become subject to various bandwagon effects, and to problematize that a little bit as to why circular economy has now become, I think it's probably fair to say, the sort of queen of the ball in sustainability circles, particularly governmental and organizational and corporate. And so whether it really just is a way of dressing up business as usual in a sort of soft-spoken form of sustainability, and that part of the reason for its embrace is that it doesn't have, that's particularly prominent, publicly prominent circular economy exponents avoid the more sort of challenging pitfalls of sufficiency, of limits, of planetary boundaries, and kind of offer the prospect of continuing to run the machine, in more or less its customary mode, without really developing an informed conception of the consumer. That circular economy, and again, I say this amongst friends, is kind of the dressed up newest notion of talking about sustainable production, without recognizing the other side of that dualism. And we do have people who have invoked the notion of circular society, which I think does move the needle a little bit, but I doubt that this idea of a circular society has really been embraced or taken up by the mainstream of circular economy researchers and practitioners. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Maurie, and others might want to comment on that, on those ideas about whether it is just a sort of a further green growth strategy. But Annie, you perhaps wanted to come in on the inner cycle actions, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think these inner cycle actions, they actually are, in those cases, we are actually not talking, it's not just greenwashing kind of actions. They are actually quite big changes that we require both from the demand side and from the production side for those to happen, not just like increasing material efficiency in production, but actually especially related to the kind of extending the lifetime of products and finding also alternative ways of consuming, like more service-oriented consumption ways and different diets and so forth. So in that sense, I think those are especially the trickier ones because they require a little bit bigger change. They require change in maybe in legislation if we think about construction materials and how much we can actually use them, like reuse for reuse purposes. There can be kind of a legislative, like kind of a prohibit like that they are not you are forbidden to reuse certain elements, for example, or then there are kind of a lack of incentives in the economy to recycle things or remanufacture or whatever. So we need a lot of, there is not just one kind of a silver bullet to solve this problem, but we need kind of a reshape the legislation, think about policies, reshape policies, think how to kind of educate consumers, kind of find ways to make more informative labels that they can make more wiser consumption decision. But it kind of covers so, and we need to make a lot for this kind of these inner cycle circular economy actions to actually be adopted at large scale. But that's just yeah, we are just in the beginning of this kind of a adoption related to these inner cycle actions.
Thank you, Annie. I just forget now, in your study, did you also do qualitative research? Did you go out and talk to industry practitioners? Because the construction industry is sort of famously conservative, and for good reason in many ways, you know, because they don't want buildings to fall down. So they tend to be quite nervous about new ways of doing things, or there is a culture, at least in the UK construction industry, which is changing a little bit, but this idea of focusing on waste and referring to it as muck away. So and literally, you know, what they want to do is to not really consider in any detail how they might be able to get extra value from waste, but to just sort of get it away. Did you encounter any of that in your study?
Yes, we organized some workshops, and we had policymakers and also, because this was actually, the project was also about climate change mitigation things and about biodiversity effects, and especially related to the kind of the climate change mitigation part. In that sense, we got more feedback from the sector as well. And I kind of sign what you actually say, that they are quite conservative and not willing to for big changes, but still I would say that in Finland you can see also some positive things happening, and there is also this kind of a momentum to try to find room for these circular economy solutions to happen. And especially, and also the policymakers, they try to find ways to push this sector to, like, that enable them to actually to adopt these actions. So I would say that there is a lot of happening in Finland in that field at the moment, because they try to find solution to kind of for this construction waste management and so forth, and other things. So in a way there are good things and still some kind of a conservative thoughts and resistance for change.
Thank you, Annie. That's interesting to hear. Tim, you perhaps wanted to come back to Maurie's point.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. I think, well, it's just echoing what Annie was saying, but I think there is about that previous point. There's a lot of confusion about what the circular economy really is, and I think we have to be quite clear about that the circular economy, it's not about everything for a reason. So for me, this kind of notion of a circular society is a little bit ridiculous. The circular economy is about materials. We already have the SDGs, and we don't need another sustainability avenue to kind of just replicate what the SDGs are already doing. So that kind of idea of the circular society doesn't really resonate with me. And I think it makes sense when something gains traction as fast as the circular economy has. It easily becomes misconstrued. It's taken up by different actors. I don't think that's necessarily confined just to circular economy, but to sustainability avenues in general. And I think here a particular challenge with the circular economy is that there's not a singular definition. There's over 100 definitions. So of course, people will use it for a different purposes. But I still think that, like Annie mentioned, there is a lot of momentum happening here. and in Finland, and also we have Jaco here also from the Netherlands, we do have absolute targets for decoupling. So even though some people will use the circular economy for their own ends, I think it still goes to show that you can set absolute targets. Governments can make this happen. And if we're moving towards absolute decoupling, at least we're talking about the right thing. And if we can do that in the Netherlands and Finland, hopefully more countries will follow that. I think we should be more ambitious, but that's another discussion. And I think also just why at Citra we talk about, for instance, is we work with policymakers and we work with businesses when we talk about the circular economy. So that's what we have the circular economy for, in a sense. But at Citra in parallel, our sister team works with what is a sustainable everyday life. It's equally important, but it's a different sustainability avenue. We need to think of what are my choices that I can make to talk about sufficiency. That discussion is vitally important, but the circular economy is not about everything, and I don't think it should be. And I just wanted to nod also to Enrique's point on this kind of measurements. Last week I came across from Université in Finland has, together with one of the big retailers in Finland, try to measure their biodiversity footprint. So you can definitely tie it to specific biodiversity impacts to different products. I think here, though, what the circular economy, what makes it interesting, because you can already measure biodiversity impacts. You don't need a circular economy for that. You have these, if we buy coffee that has a certain amount of land use, and if it causes it in one area, it's going to have one impact. If it causes in another, biodiversity might be higher. So you will have different impacts. So you need to look at the local context. But what that kind of misses, the research from Jyväskylä would suggest, for instance, that pork can be more sustainable than it can have a lower biodiversity footprint compared to vegetables. If it doesn't cause, because pork, we have overproduction of pork in Finland, it doesn't cause land use change in Finland. So you could argue that it has low land use change, low biodiversity impacts. But that kind of misses the point a little bit, because we're eating at a global level way too much meat. So the total pressure on nature, we need to talk about that at the same time as we look at what is the specific biodiversity impact from how much land use change does it cause where. At the same time as we talk about those local impacts, we also need to address this kind of what is the total pressure on nature. So I think that's why the circular economy is so relevant for biodiversity loss. So I will stop there. Talk way too much.
No, we welcome your insights, Tim. Thank you very much. Just before we come to Jaco and Sarah, it did strike me as a curiosity why the beginnings of this research are in Finland, and it'd be too simple to say, but because you've got a lot of sort of forestry. So, but you said it came out of some climate change work, but is there any sort of further explanation about why there's a centre of sort of research around this topic going on in Finland?
Maybe Annie has something to add, but I know Citra was early on with this first national circular economy roadmap, so that gave Finland a head start. And I think that was from early on also being plugged into the work that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has done. But I think we had an early start. I think that helped. But other countries, I think the Netherlands was really quite early as well. What do you think, Annie?
Yeah, I think like in Finland, the policymakers, and they kind of embraced in quite early stages this kind of a circular economy ideas like that Citra provided already in 2015. And then first it was maybe more when we started to think about what are the maybe potential effects of circular economy, for example, related to greenhouse gas emissions. That was maybe the first area, or related to waste management. Those were the kind of the first things that they were kind of exploring and have been explored also in other countries, even before Finland. But I remember when we were starting to make for the Finnish government this kind of assessment work related to different, like several sectors. We covered metal industry, construction and real estate, agriculture, manufacturing of food, and plastics, transportation. So we covered different sectors in that project. Quite soon we realized that it's also important to consider not just only the climate impacts, but also the biodiversity aspect. And what makes it maybe easier in Finland to start to do this assessment work, like a country level assessment, is that we have really detailed analyses on the causes related to biodiversity, like what actually causes biodiversity loss in Finland and outside Finnish borders. So these different assessment works related to biodiversity loss are really kind of well done in Finland related to habitats and species and the causes. So it kind of enabled us to kind of widen the exploration of the circular economy impacts on the biodiversity as well. But I cannot. I was like, we were sketching the research idea with the Ministry of Environment in Finland. So it kind of was there. Our research institutes and the ministry's kind of a combined effort to start. But we noticed that there is not much kind of information on the topic yet. When we started the work, but we learned a lot from the studies that were made related to waste management, like resource use management, and then related to greenhouse gas emissions. So they helped us a lot also.
Thank you, Annie. That's insightful, and Tim as well. Jaakko, I think you came in.
Thank you. Really nice to be here, and let me put a few things together. What has been mentioned, and I would like to respond to. I see the remark from Maurie in the chat, and I think that the first principle or the main principle should be reduce or refuse or narrow. So it is there, not always so much done on it, but it is part of the principles. And what I really take from this session is that we're doing quite a bit on circular economy or circular solutions, that they really are in need of a biodiversity check or a nature check. What are the implications? So I'm really taking that with me from this session here today. Never thought so much about it. And on the one hand, there are like opportunities in the sense of that there is there's much to gain from more natural materials, but that may come with challenges for the biodiversity. We all know that production forests, just to mention one thing, have lower biodiversity than say more natural or less intensively managed forests. Then one more thing about the discussion that was taking place is that for me the SDGs are quite a different set of goals, and actually circularity or circular economy has relevance to quite a number of them, not only the responsible consumption and production. And for me, it's not only about the materials, but it's for sure, and I think we talked a little about, or we should talk more about it, is also we need more discussion about what is the kind of economic model or alternative economic model that sustains a circular economy. And then you're already quite close to what the thinking about the circular society. So I see that a bit more related. Of course, we can work really well on circular solutions and that part, but there's also the bigger picture, whereas in my view, quite a lot of links to SDGs, different SDGs, but also about what is the kind of economic system and the kind of economic logic that sustains or promotes or stimulates the circular economy. Well, I hope that's an input in this discussion.
Thank you, Jaakko. Yeah, excellent point. Sorry, I was just flailing around to find the mute button. Sarah, would you like to come in?
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry I cannot turn my camera on, but as an architecture student in Switzerland, I was very interested that there was so much being said around construction, and especially the last comment from Maurie on the chat. And I am not an expert in the field by no means, but what I could personally experience in the last few years of just the time where I was a student was this major shift happening in the architecture teaching of pushing it into a complete different direction than it had been before. And for example, keeping the existing, like learning how to build within what's existing and learning how to densify, as well as planning for durability of materials and systems and repairability have been a very central point of what has been taught to us, which in a way is very interesting to see because it gives a bit of hope towards all of that system. I don't know if it's just something from Switzerland or if it had been applied elsewhere, but it is definitely being done here in my school. And so going from there, even though we are still trying to reuse what has been built as it is and densify, there are very major breaks to the circular economy in the construction field, I feel, from what I could experience in internship, but as well as people say from the norms, which is a reason the norms right now, especially in Switzerland, are very strong, and they don't allow for any reuse of materials in some ways. And so that's the reason why I'm also a bit skeptical about labels, because as soon as you mark something with that sticker on it, then it is possible that you cannot use other things instead of that are already existing. So that's maybe something that I don't know, is a break, at least for the architecture field. And also, as we were talking earlier about things that might be problems, the timeline is very different than from normal construction, and also the way you insure yourself. There are not a lot of people that are going to be okay with like taking the risks with you, insurance company and such. And so it's difficult to put those changes, to transfer those changes on those ideas from the teaching field to the actual building in the end. And I think one of the main things that was made clear to us was the fact that you radically have to change the perception of people if you want to be something that they get interested in. For example, not consider a building to be demolished as a wasteland, but consider it as something with a lot of value. And that implies so many changes in the way the consumer thinks that, first of all, I don't think we're equipped as architects to deal with that. And so I wonder if you had inputs on that topic as well, like how can we, because I know it diverges a bit of biodiversity loss. I'm not very acquainted with that topic, even though I found it very interesting in the link to land use. But there is also, so I was wondering if you have inputs on the fact that we need to change the perception of people to make that happen. And at least, I guess it has a relevance in the construction field, but probably in others as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Some excellent points there that about the idiosyncrasies of the construction industry and the built environment. You're right that it is an industry that is not making toasters. You know, it's making products and providing services for centuries potentially, and so some of those considerations run deep. And you're absolutely right around the norms of society and the lock-in associated there. I too have seen a change. I first looked at construction back in 99, early 2000s, and have sort of gone back to it through over the last 20 years or so. And I do see some changing attitudes and leaders and demonstration projects, and you could point to some really good examples, but there's still also a tale of old practices and old ways of doing things which can be difficult to get over. But I wonder if we can pick up on Sarah's point, actually, and it's been raised earlier again today, about this idea of labeling. I mean, if we were able to measure the biodiversity impacts of products or services from, you know, iPhones to cars to even buildings, would it make a difference to people's behavior and people's consumption patterns? So measuring it is one thing, seeing a change is another thing. What do people think about that? Yeah, Tim.
Just a really quick point, like as I mentioned before, we need these kind of business solutions. We need the policy instruments, like that's the circular economy, but we also really need to work on kind of how do we enable changes in our everyday life, in consumer behavior. It's equally important. But I see it as a little bit separate from the circular economy, but it's really vital.
Stephen, and then Jose.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question about consumer side and behavior change issues. I think it gets back to what Marlene was trying to discuss earlier during Maurie's keynote, but it's what a lot of the research shows is this the labeling approach can impact some consumers, but for the most part, it doesn't change behavior so much. I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done over the last 20 years in sustainable consumption that comes to that conclusion, and that's why we shift to looking at systems in general and the way in which consumers' practices are shaped. And there's only a certain kind of portion of shoppers that have the access to these items, or even have the money to select more sustainable goods and these kinds of things. So they're quite limited in that way. And I think it comes back to a much more complex sort of idea of where to think about consumer behavior. I think that has to be something that's a bit more kind of nuanced and sort of deeper kind of reflection has to take place than the idea that the circular economy will just work with consumers choosing better is just kind of a bit of a weak approach, I think.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a good way of putting it. Annie, would you like to come in on this point?
Yes, I was thinking, of course, the kind of the demand creates the need for also for the production side. So of course, kind of also the demand is a one key element on enabling this circular economy solutions to also happen in the production side. But in many cases, I also agree that the most like the refuse and reduce, those are the most effective kind of levers which kind of solve no matter what kind of environmental problem we are thinking about. And if we go to the like a little bit like other levels, I think still that also if you are comparing two products, the one made of recycled material or something, it shouldn't be twice as expensive. So there is something wrong in the whole mechanisms, how we are able to kind of how the price is formed. So this kind of a product made of these virgin raw materials, it doesn't include this kind of the price of the negative externalities that it creates. So there is a big need to also, I think, rethink this, how, because there are not many kind of a natural resource taxes, for example, in place in different countries, or if there are, they are not high enough. So it's kind of that we have to make the incentives also for the consumers to kind of to reflect the actual kind of effects the products have on the environment, and in that we have not succeeded, not at all. So that's the thing that I think as an economist would be a really effective way to start to shape. Of course, then also the manufacturing side would start to find alternative and less harmful ways of producing, and that would kind of maybe make the big wheel start to turn. But yeah.
Thank you very much. Any points about internalizing these externalities there? Jose, I'm guessing that you might want to come on this connecting consumers with markets for biodiversity, which is relevant to the to indigenous communities and shifting practices and connecting with global value chains.
Yes, Paul. Yes, I wanted to share something that has come out from our research in the Amazon rainforest. So the Amazon rainforest is a very particular place in the sense that biodiversity is, let's say, a major driver of that region, right? And there's a strong discussion on ways of developing that region in a sustainable way. So, for example, the government is promoting intensive forms of agriculture that are linked with chocolate and coffee and these kinds of new types of products that are being consumed widely all over the world. So they're promoting it to be organic, and within those forms of intensive agriculture, you can find some circular practices as well. But it doesn't mean that they are not intensive, right? It doesn't mean that they don't require extensive areas of land that go against primary and secondary forests in the regions. Now, that's one way of looking at development in the region. There's another way, which is what I was describing earlier, this rotative system. Now, the problem with the rotative system is that it's considered to be survival agriculture, because you cannot have economies of scale. It's really hard to have economies of scale with that system. Now, and this comes the connection with the consumer. So the only way that some of our experts were mentioning how can this type of system, which protects biodiversity in a greater extent than intensive forms of agriculture, even though when they are considered to be sustainable, it's only the consumer is capable of realizing that the modes of production have an impact in biodiversity. So there needs to be a transfer of value in how these actors produce those products, and there needs to be a connection with those consumers. So the consumers are key if you would like to have this type of biodiverse systems maintained through time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Good points. Stephen.
Just a quick comment on the agricultural system discussion. I think, yeah, it is a question of maybe less. There's a reason that these traditional agricultural systems in places like Brazil, like these rotational slash and burn, these kinds of systems still persist. It's because they work. And I don't think, as you say, rightfully so, they're not recognized as sort of being cutting edge. They're backwards, they're from another era, but there's a reason that they persist. And even though they may be sort of survivalist, there's probably many, many places around the world where people are still practicing agriculture in this way. And actually, if you look at where the agriculture impacts, sustainability impacts are happening, it's in these intensive systems, it's in the industrial system. So these are examples of real sustainability. And I think, yeah, as you just mentioned now, how do you support those? Consumers can play a role for sure, if they can sort of understand and make different, like kind of direct connections with those sort of farmers and smallholders and support them. but they shouldn't be treated, and I think this is where we get back into the discussion around economic logics and things. Food should not be treated in the same way as, television sets and cars. I mean, we die without food. So maybe at the national level or local level, we should be thinking about, how to support these basic, kind of resources that we all need to survive. And in different economic logics are required to do that, I think, for sure.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that it also goes back to this point that context matters here, geography matters here when we're considering circular actions. We heard about Finland from Eni, a little bit from Tim. We heard about Textile Pakistan from Enrique. We heard about the Amazon. I just wanted to bring you in, David. I wondered whether in your work in South Africa, so we should have had a speaker on from South Africa today. She was unfortunately poorly and couldn't make it, but her organisation is there to support natural resource management, seeking to protect biodiversity, but with those wider ambitions to support communities, youth empowerment, gender empowerment as well. I wondered in your work on sort of social entrepreneurship, whether you'd come across initiatives around biodiversity and waste, perhaps, or.
So thanks, Paul, for putting me on the. Just trying to think. I mean, I kind of was in a lot of ways. I was more because I was focusing or sort of leading the breakout group in terms of sort of consumption. I probably had my head a little bit on kind of the consumption side as much as anything. I mean, I guess one of the things that maybe links to the contextual element that I was kind of thinking about is I feel like maybe a lot of the conversations that we sort of had about consumption are perhaps particularly focused more on let's say consumers in developed economies. I think there is a question about, okay, when clearly the consumption footprint of people in developed economies is a heck of a lot kind of higher than what we see in South Africa or other kind of developing economies and things, or sort of emerging economies. But I guess there is that sort of question of how some of those things change, how we might let's say bring kind of circular sort of consumption practices to other parts of the world, how relevant those types of questions are. I mean, I think one of the interesting bits of work that I do is around let's say base of the pyramid kind of projects. So in various ways, whether it's in some instances of social businesses, but in other instances just kind of MNCs that are kind of targeting kind of low-income consumers for products in various ways. And I think kind of one of the things that we see there is you might argue that, let's say, if you viewed some of those interventions in kind of a positive light, you'd say, okay, some of this consumption is kind of necessary, important, has kind of positive implications in terms of kind of human development, but often there is a big environmental kind of footprint in terms of, let's say, sort of the single kind of sachet products and things that are sort of being sold. So I think for me in that element there's a bit of a tension, or the third sort of breakout group that we were going to have, where we kind of talked, okay, you're providing maybe in theory kind of needed goods and services, but if they're having quite a negative environmental impact in terms of biodiversity amongst everything else, kind of we sort of see that tension there. I mean, I thought also, I mean, I guess when I was thinking about the consumption as a question, I mean, I was also wondering a bit about, as people have mentioned, sort of attitude behavior gaps and things, and I guess I would sort of see that probably in a lot of ways that would sort of continue even with sort of labeling, whether it comes to biodiversity more specifically, that I think we'd still kind of see those types of things. I mean, I'm struggling to think of a specific kind of example from my work to bring in beyond kind of almost raising that question, I guess, of kind of consumers elsewhere. So yeah, consumers in other parts of the world, and yeah, I guess just thinking about how relevant what the circular economy means for South Africa and other kind of developing economies. But maybe it doesn't answer your question so much, Paul.
No, thank you for that, David. I just wanted to bring you in to let you share some insights from the work that you do. In the literature, you do begin to see a little bit of biodiversity coming into those discussions around waste management, albeit in perhaps it's a sort of a low level in terms of what the waste causing a problem, and those informal routines of, for instance, waste picking, helping to solve that problem in some cases. So I'd like to, I'm conscious of the time. We have just 4 minutes left. So I want to thank you all. I'm going to go back to my slides here. Oops, I was going to show that. Never mind. I wanted to just say a series of thank yous because without everybody's input to this session, it wouldn't have been possible. Thanks first to Joe Sarkis for helping me put this workshop together. Many thanks to our speakers, Tim Forsland, Enrico Puccini, Eni Rucamo, and Jose Pineda. Many thanks to David Littlewood, Jaco Tvist, Jose Pineda, Maurie Cohen, Stephen McGreevy for facilitating the breakouts and for following me as I, at the last minute, decided to toss my orb around and change the schedule. Many thanks to the rest of you for contributing to the session, and for those of you who were here for the speakers before. Many thanks to the technical support, Zemping and Ria, and the conference organisers for all their hard work that goes into making this this conference, which is going to last for the next 2 weeks, possible. The next steps on this are for us to. We're going to work on a blog. We've discovered blogs. We love blogs. We're going to write a blog for Future Earth around this workshop. So we'll get that done before the end of the conference. We'll send you a link. We're considering writing a longer piece in the form of a sort of a short journal article for, again, aimed at practitioners. One of the Arthur D. Little publications, which we've written for before, so sort of a very practical piece there. So we'll keep you up to date on our progress for that, and we want to keep this discussion going. You know, I think we've heard many times today that this is a nascent topic, and we need to understand this better. And our next step that we're thinking about is to take this to the Academy of Management. That is a less diverse group of people, but it is sort of different management perspectives on this issue. So we'll be working on that as well over the next few months. And that, I think, from me is that. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
That's the end of day one. Okay.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see some of you then on Thursday, I think, for day 2.